Every Saturday morning, a little girl named would walk into the old community center holding her grandmother's hand. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that her grandmother always tied into two neat braids. While her grandmother signed in at the front desk to start her volunteer shift, would find a plastic chair in the corner of the main hall and sit there quietly, watching everything happen around her. The community center was always busy on Saturdays. Kids ran around laughing and shouting. Parents gathered in groups to chat about their week. Teachers set up tables for art classes and dance rehearsals, but never joined any of it. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, watching like she was invisible. And in many ways she was. At school was the kind of kid that teachers forgot about. She wasn't loud. She didn't raise her hand in class. She didn't cause trouble or do anything that made people notice her. During lunch, she usually sat alone at the end of a long table, eating the rice and vegetables her grandmother packed for her every morning. Sometimes other kids would look at her food and make faces. Sometimes they would whisper things she pretended not to hear. Had learned a long time ago that being quiet was easier than being noticed. When you were quiet, nobody bothered you. Nobody asked questions. Nobody expected anything from you, and nobody could hurt you. But there was one thing about that nobody knew. A secret she kept hidden from everyone except her grandmother and the four walls of her tiny bedroom. Could play the piano. Not just a little bit. Not just simple songs that children learn in their first lessons. Could play pieces that most adults would struggle with. She could play music that made people stop and listen, music that made people feel things deep inside their hearts. But nobody had ever heard her play, because had never told anyone. It all started 3 years ago when was only 6. Her grandmother had taken her to a garage sale down the street from their small apartment. There were old books and broken toys scattered across the lawn. Didn't care about any of it. But then she saw something in the corner, half hidden under a dusty blanket. It was a keyboard, an old electronic keyboard with black and white keys that were yellowed with age. Some of the keys were chipped. The power cord was frayed. But when looked at it, something strange happened. She felt pulled toward it like the keyboard was calling her name. Her grandmother noticed staring at it. She walked over and asked the man selling it how much he wanted for it. The man laughed and said he would take $12 just to get rid of it. He said it barely worked anymore. His grandmother didn't have much money. She worked long hours cleaning houses and offices just to pay the rent and put food on the table. $12 was not a small amount for her, but she saw the look in his eyes. She saw something there that she hadn't seen in a long time. Hoping. So she paid the $12 and carried the keyboard home herself, even though it was heavy and her back hurt from working all week. That night, plugged it in and pressed a key for the first time. The sound that came out was thin and cheap, nothing like a real piano, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. From that day on, spent every free moment with that keyboard. She didn't have money for lessons. Her grandmother couldn't afford to hire a teacher, so taught herself. She would watch videos on her grandmother's old phone, studying how concert pianists moved their fingers across the keys. She would pause the videos and replay the same 5 seconds over and over again until she understood what they were doing. Then she would practice it herself, slowly at first, making mistakes, starting over, trying again. She practiced scales until her fingers ached. She learned to read sheet music by finding free lessons online. She memorized pieces note by note, playing them so many times that she could hear the music in her head even when she was lying in bed at night trying to fall asleep. Always practiced with headphones plugged into the keyboard. She didn't want to bother anyone in the apartment next door. She didn't want her grandmother to worry that she was wasting time instead of doing homework. And most of all, she didn't want anyone to know about her secret. Because what if she wasn't really good? What if she only thought she was good because she had never played for anyone else? What if people laughed at her the way they laughed at her lunch or her old clothes or her quiet voice? The fear of being judged was stronger than the desire to be heard, so kept her music locked inside her bedroom, hidden away from the world. But on Saturdays at the community center, something changed. In the back of the building, past the main hall and down a narrow hallway, there was a storage room where they kept old chairs and folding tables and boxes of decorations from past events. Most people never went in there, but had discovered something wonderful hiding in that dusty room. A piano. It was an old upright piano pushed against the wall and forgotten. The wood was scratched and faded. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them, but it was real. It had weight and depth and a sound that cheap keyboard could never match. When she pressed a key on this piano, she could feel the vibration travel through her fingers and up her arms and into her chest. Every Saturday, while her grandmother worked at the front desk, would slip away to that storage room. She would close the door behind her, sit down on the wobbly bench and play. She played everything she had been practicing all week. She played and Chopin. She played pieces that were meant for concert halls, not dusty storage rooms. She played with her eyes closed, letting her fingers find the notes from memory, losing herself completely in the music. In those moments was not the invisible girl who sat alone at lunch. She was not the quiet kid that teachers forgot about. She was someone else entirely, someone powerful, someone full of emotion and life and beauty. But she always played alone. She always kept the door closed, and she always stopped before anyone could hear her. Didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. In just a few weeks, the community center would be hosting its biggest event of the year, the Spring Talent Showcase. Kids from all over the neighborhood had signed up to perform. There would be dancers and singers and magicians, and there would be a piano performance, the most important part of the whole show. But had no plans to be part of any of it. She was happy in her storage room, playing for an audience of no one. She had convinced herself that this was enough, that her music was meant to stay hidden forever. She had no idea that fate had other plans. And she had no idea that in just a few days, her entire life would change because of a broken wrist and an open door. The Spring Talent Showcase was the biggest event of the year at the community center. People talked about it for months. Families bought tickets weeks in advance. The local newspaper always sent someone to write about it. Even the mayor came every year and sat in the front row with a big smile on his face. This year was going to be even more special. The showcase was being dedicated to the memory of a man named Mr., a kind old gentleman who had passed away the previous winter. Mr. had been part of the community center for over 40 years. He had taught music lessons to hundreds of children. He had organized concerts and recitals and holiday performances. And most importantly, he had donated the beautiful grand piano that sat on the main stage. That piano was Mr.'s pride and joy. He had saved money for years to buy it. When he gave it to the community center, he said he wanted every child to have the chance to make music, no matter where they came from or how much money their family had. The piano had been played at every showcase since then. It was a tradition, a way of honoring Mr.'s memory and everything he believed in. This year, a 12-year-old boy named Jun had been chosen to play the piano solo. Jun was the star student of the music teacher at the center. He had been taking lessons since he was 5 years old. His parents had paid for the best teachers, the best books, the best everything. Jun practiced on a shiny black grand piano in his living room. He had won competitions. He had performed at recitals all over the city. Everyone expected Jun to deliver a perfect performance. The program had already been printed. His name was listed in bold letters. The music teacher had spent weeks helping him prepare a complicated piece that would show off all his skills. Everything was set. And then, 3 days before the showcase, everything fell apart. Jun was at the park with his friends, showing off on his skateboard. He tried to do a trick he had seen in a video online. He jumped, the board slipped out from under him, and he landed hard on the concrete with his arm twisted underneath his body. The pain was immediate and terrible. His mother rushed him to the hospital. The doctor took one look at the x-ray and shook his head. Jun's wrist was broken in 2 places. He would need a cast for at least 6 weeks. There would be no piano performance, not this year. When the news reached the community center, it spread like wildfire. Parents whispered about it in the hallways. Kids talked about it during their dance rehearsals. And Mrs., the woman in charge of organizing the entire showcase, felt like the ground had dropped out from under her feet. Mrs. was a small woman with gray hair and glasses that always seemed to slide down her nose. She had been running the Spring Talent Showcase for 15 years. She had dealt with problems before: singers who lost their voices, dancers who forgot their routines, sound systems that broke down at the last minute. But this was different. This was the piano solo. This was the heart of the entire show. She sat in her office with her head in her hands, trying to figure out what to do. Her assistant stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard and looking nervous. "We could just cut the piano segment," her assistant suggested. "Move the dance number up and end with the choir. Nobody would notice." Mrs. looked up with tired eyes. "Everyone would notice. This showcase is dedicated to Mr. The piano solo is the whole point. We can't just skip it." "Then what do? The show is in 3 days. We don't have anyone else who can play at that level." Mrs. didn't have an answer. She stared at the program sitting on her desk, at Jun's name printed in those bold letters, and felt a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She had promised Mr.'s family that this showcase would be something special. She had promised them that his memory would be honored. And now she was going to let everyone down. That evening, Mrs. stayed late at the community center. Everyone else had gone home. The hallways were dark and quiet. She walked through the building slowly, checking that all the doors were locked and all the lights were turned off. Her footsteps echoed on the tile floor. She was almost at the back exit when she heard something that made her stop. Music. It was faint at first, so soft that she thought she might be imagining it. But as she stood there in the dark hallway, the sound grew clearer. Someone was playing the piano, not the grand piano on the main stage. This sound was coming from somewhere else, somewhere in the back of the building. Mrs. followed the music. She walked past the storage closets and the old bathrooms and the room where they kept the broken chairs waiting to be fixed. The sound got louder with every step, and the more she listened, the more confused she became. Because this was not simple music. This was not a beginner practicing scales. This was something else entirely, something beautiful and complicated and full of emotion. It sounded like the recordings she used to listen to of famous pianists performing in grand concert halls. It sounded impossible. She reached the storage room at the end of the hallway. The door was closed, but a thin strip of light glowed underneath it. The music was coming from inside. Mrs. put her hand on the doorknob. She turned it slowly and pushed the door open just a few inches, just enough to see inside. And what she saw made her forget how to breathe. There was the quiet little girl who came every Saturday with her grandmother, the invisible child who sat in the corner and never talked to anyone. She was sitting at the old upright piano with her eyes closed, her small fingers flying across the keys like they had a life of their own. She was playing Chopin, one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano, music that professional pianists spent years trying to master. And this tiny 9-year-old girl was playing it from memory, without sheet music, without hesitation, without a single mistake. Mrs. stood frozen in the doorway. She watched hands move across the keyboard, watched the way her whole body swayed with the music, watched the expression on her face change with every phrase. There was something in this child's playing that went beyond technique, beyond practice. There was feeling. There was heart. There was something that could not be taught. The piece built to its climax, the notes tumbling over each other like waves crashing on rocks. Then it softened, grew gentle, and finally faded into silence. Opened her eyes. and she saw Mrs. standing in the doorway. The little girl jumped up so fast that the piano bench nearly fell over. Her face turned red. Her hands started shaking. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, terrified and ready to run. "I'm sorry," whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I'll leave. Please don't tell my grandmother, please." But Mrs. didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there with tears forming in her eyes, staring at this child who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Finally, after what felt like forever, Mrs. stepped into the room and closed the door softly behind her. "How long have you been playing?" she asked. "Looked down at the floor. 3 years." "Who taught you?" "Nobody. I taught myself." Mrs. felt her heart squeeze tight in her chest. She thought about Mr. and everything he had believed in. She thought about his words, spoken so many times over the years. Talent doesn't come from money or fancy lessons. Talent comes from the heart. She had just found something extraordinary, something that could save the showcase, something that could change this little girl's life forever. Now she just had to convince to share her gift with the world. Wanted to disappear. She wanted to melt into the floor and vanish forever. Her secret was out. The one thing she had kept hidden from the world for 3 years was no longer hers alone. And now this woman was standing in front of her, looking at her with an expression couldn't understand. "Please," said again, her voice shaking. "Please don't tell anyone. I wasn't supposed to be in here. I know I shouldn't have touched the piano. I'm sorry." Mrs. walked slowly across the room and sat down on an old folding chair near the piano. She didn't look angry. She didn't look upset. If anything, she looked like someone who had just witnessed a miracle. "How old are you?" Mrs. asked softly. 9. "And you taught yourself to play like that, with no teacher, no lessons?" Nodded, still staring at the floor. She was waiting for the lecture, waiting to be told that she had done something wrong, waiting for the disappointment that always seemed to follow whenever anyone paid attention to her. But the lecture never came. Instead, Mrs. leaned forward and said something that never expected to hear. "That was the most beautiful piano playing I have ever heard in this building, and I have been here for 15 years. Looked up, confused. She searched Mrs. face for signs that she was joking or lying or trying to trick her somehow. But all she saw was honesty. All she saw was wonder. "I need to ask you something," Mrs. continued, "and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Our piano player for the showcase broke his wrist. The show is in 3 days. We don't have anyone else who can perform. Would you be willing to play?" The words hit like a punch to the stomach. Play, at the showcase, in front of all those people, in front of the whole community. The thought made her feel sick. "I can't," whispered immediately. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because I'm not good enough. Because people will laugh at me. Because I've never played for anyone before. Because—" His voice trailed off. She didn't know how to explain all the fears that were swirling inside her head. There were too many of them. They were too big, too heavy. Mrs. was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and walked over to the piano. She ran her fingers gently along the top of it, brushing away a thin layer of dust. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked. Didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. So Mrs. began to speak. "There was a man named Mr. who used to come to this community center every single day. He taught piano lessons to children for over 40 years. Rich kids, poor kids, kids with talent, kids who could barely find middle C. He never turned anyone away. He never charged more than a family could afford. Some families couldn't afford anything at all, and he taught their children for free." Mrs. paused, her eyes growing distant with memory. "Mr. grew up very poor. His family didn't have money for food sometimes, let alone music lessons. But when he was about your age, he found an old piano in a church basement. The church let him practice there whenever he wanted. He taught himself to play just like you did, and that piano saved his life." Listened without moving. Something about this story felt familiar. Something about it felt like looking into a mirror. Mr. used to say that music was a gift, Mrs. continued, but not the kind of gift you keep for yourself, the kind of gift you're supposed to share. He believed that when someone has a talent like yours, they have a responsibility to let others hear it, because you never know whose life you might change. You never know who might be sitting in that audience, feeling sad or hopeless or invisible, and your music might be exactly what they need to hear. Mrs. turned to look at directly. Mr. passed away last winter. This showcase is dedicated to his memory. The piano solo was supposed to honor everything he believed in. And then I walked into this room tonight and heard you play, and I thought maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe this was supposed to happen. Felt tears burning in her eyes. She didn't want to cry. She hated crying in front of people, but she couldn't stop the emotion rising up inside her chest. What if I make mistakes? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if I forget the notes? What if everyone thinks I'm terrible? Mrs. smiled gently. What if none of that happens? What if you walk out on that stage and play exactly the way you played tonight? What if you show everyone what you're capable of? Didn't have an answer. She just stood there with her hands trembling at her sides, feeling like her whole world was spinning. Mrs. didn't push any further. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out a small card with her phone number on it, and placed it on top of the piano. Think about it tonight, she said. Talk to your grandmother, and if you decide you want to do this, call me tomorrow. I'll be waiting. Then she walked out of the room and closed the door behind her, leaving alone with the piano and her thoughts. That night couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed in her small room, staring at the ceiling while her grandmother's snores drifted through the thin walls. Her mind kept replaying everything Mrs. had said, about Mr., about gifts, about sharing music with the world. But mostly, she kept thinking about fear. Had been afraid for as long as she could remember, afraid of being noticed, afraid of being judged, afraid of reaching for something and failing. She had built her whole life around staying small and staying quiet and staying safe. And now someone was asking her to step out of the shadows and let everyone see her. The thought was terrifying. But somewhere underneath that terror, there was something else. A tiny spark that had been trying to ignore for years. A voice that whispered in the back of her mind every time she played the piano. What if someone could hear this? What if someone could feel what I feel when I play? Around midnight, got out of bed and walked quietly into the living room. Her grandmother was asleep in the bedroom next door, sat down on the couch and looked at the old keyboard sitting in the corner. The same keyboard her grandmother had bought for $12 at a garage sale 3 years ago. The same keyboard that had changed her life. She thought about her grandmother carrying that heavy keyboard all the way home, even though her back hurt. She thought about all the sacrifices her grandmother had made just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She thought about how hard her grandmother worked every single day, never complaining, never asking for anything in return. And then thought about what it would feel like to make her grandmother proud. Really, truly proud. To show her that those $12 had been worth something. To show her that all those hours of practice hadn't been wasted. By the time the sun came up, had made her decision. She walked into her grandmother's room and gently shook her awake. Her grandmother opened her eyes slowly, confused by the early morning visit. "What's wrong?" her grandmother asked, sitting up with worry in her voice. Took a deep breath. Then she told her grandmother everything, about the piano in the storage room, about Mrs. finding her, about the showcase and the broken wrist and the chance to perform. When she finished, her grandmother was silent for a long time, watched her face, trying to read her expression, terrified of what she might say. Finally, her grandmother reached out and took hands in her own. Her fingers were rough and calloused from years of hard work, but her grip was warm and strong and full of love. "I hear you practice every night," her grandmother said softly, "through the walls. I've heard you for 3 years. I always knew you were special. I was just waiting for you to know it too." Felt the tears finally spill down her cheeks. She couldn't hold them back anymore. "I'm scared, Grandma." Her grandmother pulled her into a tight hug and held her close. "Being scared is okay," she whispered. "Being scared means you care, but don't let fear steal your chance to shine. You've been hiding long enough. It's time for the world to hear what I've been hearing all along." That afternoon, picked up the phone and called Mrs. "I'll do it," she said. And with those 3 words, everything changed. The next 3 days went by in a blur. Mrs. arranged for to practice on the grand piano in the main hall after the community center closed each evening. The first time sat down at that piano, she almost forgot how to breathe. It was nothing like the old upright in the storage room, nothing like her cheap keyboard at home. This piano was alive. Every key responded to her touch like it was waiting for her. Every note rang out rich and full and beautiful. But as much as loved playing that piano, she couldn't escape the fear that followed her everywhere. It sat in her stomach like a heavy stone. It kept her awake at night. It made her hands shake every time she thought about what was coming. The night before the showcase, barely slept at all. She lay in bed watching the hours tick by on her old alarm clock. 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw hundreds of faces staring at her, waiting for her to fail. When morning finally came, felt like a ghost. Her grandmother made her eat breakfast even though she had no appetite. Rice porridge with a little sugar on top, the same thing her grandmother made whenever was sick or sad or scared. Forced down a few bites, but everything tasted like cardboard. "You're going to be wonderful," her grandmother said, squeezing her hand across the small kitchen table. "I already know it." Wished she could believe her. The showcase was scheduled to start at 6 in the evening. By 4 o'clock, and her grandmother arrived at the community center. The parking lot was already filling up with cars. Volunteers were setting up chairs and testing microphones and hanging a big banner that read "Spring Talent Showcase" in bright blue letters. Mrs. met them at the back entrance and led to a small room behind the stage where the performers were getting ready. There were kids everywhere, dancers stretching their legs, a boy practicing magic tricks with a deck of cards, a group of girls in matching outfits going over their song one more time. Everyone looked excited and confident and ready. Everyone except. She sat in the corner of the room in the simple blue dress her grandmother had borrowed from a neighbor. It was a little too big for her, but her grandmother had stayed up late the night before taking it in so it would fit better. Kept smoothing down the fabric with her hands, trying to keep them from shaking. Some of the other kids looked at her curiously. A few of them recognized her from school. She could hear them whispering, "Isn't that the quiet girl who sits alone at lunch? She's doing the piano solo. I thought Jun was supposed to play. She probably just knows one easy song or something." Pretended not to hear. She stared at the floor and tried to remember how to breathe. At 5:30, Mrs. gathered all the performers together and gave them a pep talk. She told them to have fun and do their best and remember that everyone in the audience was there to support them. Then she looked directly at and gave her a small, encouraging nod. At 6 o'clock, the showcase began. Watched from the side of the stage as one act after another performed. The dancers were good. The magician made people laugh. The choir sang a beautiful song that made some of the parents cry. With every performance that ended, his heart beat a little faster. Her turn was getting closer. She could feel it coming like a train she couldn't stop. Finally, Mrs. walked onto the stage and picked up the microphone. "Our next performance is very special," she said, her voice echoing through the silent auditorium. "As many of you know, this showcase is dedicated to the memory of Mr., who gave so much to this community over the years. Mr. believed that music was a gift meant to be shared. He believed that talent could come from anywhere, from anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances." Mrs. paused and looked toward the side of the stage where was standing Tonight, we have a young performer who I think would have made Mr. very proud. She taught herself to play the piano. She has never performed for an audience before. Please welcome to the stage, 9-year-old. The applause was polite but confused. People looked at their programs, trying to find information about this unknown girl. Parents whispered to each other. The mayor, sitting in the front row, leaned over to ask someone who she was. Walked onto the stage. The lights were so bright that she could barely see the audience, but she could feel them. Hundreds of eyes watching her every step. Hundreds of people waiting to see what this strange little girl could do. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the spotlights. It looked enormous. It looked terrifying. Walked toward it slowly, her legs feeling like they were made of wood. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it the way Mrs. had taught her. She placed her hands on the keys. The piano felt cold under her fingertips. And then something terrible happened. Her mind went completely blank. She couldn't remember the first note. She couldn't remember any of the notes. The music that had lived inside her head for years suddenly vanished, like someone had erased it all in an instant. Her hands started to tremble. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence in the auditorium grew heavy and uncomfortable. Someone in the back coughed. A baby started crying somewhere in the middle rows. Heard a few people shifting in their seats. She was frozen, completely and totally frozen. From her seat in the 5th row, his grandmother watched with her hands pressed together like she was praying. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She just watched her granddaughter sitting alone on that big stage, and she believed. Closed her eyes. She blocked out the lights. She blocked out the audience. She blocked out the whispers and the coughs and the crying baby. She went somewhere deep inside herself, to the place where the music lived, to the place where she had spent thousands of hours alone with her keyboard and her headphones and her dreams. And then she heard it, faint at first like a distant memory, the opening notes of Moonlight Sonata, the piece she had played so many times that it was part of her soul. Took a breath, she let it out slowly. And she began to play. The first notes floated through the auditorium like a whisper in the dark, soft and gentle and impossibly beautiful. The restless audience went still. The crying baby quieted down. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Played with her eyes closed, letting her fingers find their own way across the keys. She forgot about the audience. She forgot about the lights. She forgot about everything except the music flowing through her like water through a river. The piece built slowly, growing from a whisper to a conversation to a story being told without words. Small hands moved across the piano with a grace and confidence that seemed impossible for someone her age. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was full of emotion. In the 5th row, his grandmother had tears streaming down her face. She didn't bother wiping them away. Mrs. stood at the side of the stage with her hand pressed over her heart, barely breathing. The mayor leaned forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open, completely transfixed. And then did something unexpected. Instead of ending with the first movement like she had planned, she continued into the 3rd movement. The fast one, the difficult one, the one that most professional pianists struggled to play correctly. Her fingers flew across the keys like they had wings. The music exploded through the auditorium, filling every corner with sound and energy and passion. It was fierce and beautiful and alive. It was everything had kept locked inside herself for 9 years, finally breaking free. When the last note faded into silence, opened her eyes. For a moment, nobody moved. The auditorium was completely still. And then, starting from somewhere in the back, someone began to clap, then another person, then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. The applause was deafening, crashing over like a wave. People were cheering. People were crying. People were looking at each other in disbelief, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Sat at the piano, blinking in the bright lights, completely overwhelmed. She had done it. She had finally let the world hear her music. And nothing would ever be the same again. Didn't know how long the applause lasted. It could have been 30 seconds. It could have been 5 minutes. Time had stopped making sense. She sat at the piano bench with her hands still resting on the keys, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except stare out at the sea of people standing on their feet and clapping for her. For her, the quiet girl, the invisible girl, the girl who ate lunch alone and never raised her hand in class and spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. They were all looking at her now, and they weren't laughing. They weren't whispering mean things. They were cheering. Mrs. appeared at her side and gently helped her stand up. His legs felt wobbly, like she had just run a marathon. Mrs. guided her to the front of the stage and whispered in her ear to take a bow. Bent forward awkwardly, not really knowing what she was doing, and the applause grew even louder. Then she saw her grandmother. The old woman was standing in the 5th row, clapping so hard that her whole body was shaking. Tears were streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Her eyes were shining with something had never seen before. Pride. Pure, overwhelming, uncontainable pride. Felt her own eyes fill with tears. She wanted to run off the stage and throw herself into her grandmother's arms. But Mrs. was leading her toward the side of the stage, and people kept reaching out to touch her shoulder and tell her how amazing she was, and everything was happening so fast that could barely keep up. Backstage, the other performers surrounded her. The same kids who had been whispering about her an hour ago were now looking at her like she was some kind of celebrity. The dancers wanted to know where she learned to play. The magician asked if she could teach him piano. Even the choir girls, who had barely glanced at her before, were telling her how incredible she was. Didn't know what to say. She just nodded and mumbled thank you over and over again, feeling completely overwhelmed. Then the mayor appeared. He was a tall man with gray hair and a fancy suit, and he walked straight toward with a huge smile on his face. He shook her hand firmly and told her that in all his years of attending the Spring Talent Showcase, he had never seen anything like what she had just done. He asked her about her training, and when told him she had taught herself on a $12 keyboard, his eyes went wide with disbelief. "This young lady is exactly what Mr. always talked about," the mayor said to Mrs. "Talent coming from the most unexpected places. We need to make sure she gets every opportunity she deserves." After the showcase ended, finally found her grandmother waiting for her near the back exit. The old woman didn't say anything at first. She just opened her arms and fell into them like she was 6 years old again. They held each other for a long time, neither of them speaking, both of them crying. "I'm so proud of you," her grandmother finally whispered. So proud." Buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder. She could smell the familiar scent of laundry soap and green tea, the smell of home, the smell of safety. In that moment, all the fear and stress and pressure of the past few days melted away. Nothing else mattered, just this, just the two of them. The days that followed were unlike anything had ever experienced. First came the local newspaper. A reporter showed up at their apartment 2 days after the showcase, wanting to write a story about the self-taught piano prodigy. Was shy and didn't know how to answer most of the questions, but her grandmother sat beside her the whole time, filling in the details and beaming with pride. The article ran on the front page of the community section. There was a photo of sitting at the grand piano, her small hands hovering over the keys. The headline read, "9-year-old teaches herself piano, stuns audience at local showcase." Then the story spread. Someone shared the newspaper article online, and within a week, it had been seen by thousands of people. A local television station reached out asking if they could do a segment on. A radio host invited her to come on his show and play something live on air. People had never met started sending letters to the community center, telling her how much her story had inspired them. But the biggest surprise came 3 weeks after the showcase. A letter arrived at their apartment with a fancy logo on the envelope. His grandmother opened it carefully and read it out loud, her voice trembling with every word. It was from a prestigious music school in the city. They had heard about its performance and watched a video someone had recorded on their phone. They were offering her a full scholarship to study piano with some of the best teachers in the country. Everything would be paid for. Tuition, books, even transportation. All had to do was say yes. Couldn't believe it. She read the letter 5 times, sure that she was misunderstanding something. But the words stayed the same every time. Full scholarship, best teachers, every opportunity she deserves. That night, and her grandmother sat together on the old couch in their small living room. The $12 keyboard sat in the corner where it had always been, its yellowed keys worn smooth from years of practice. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled in the darkness. "Are you happy?" her grandmother asked softly. Thought about the question. She thought about the scholarship and the newspaper article and the television interviews. She thought about all the people who had reached out to tell her how talented she was, how special, how destined for great things. But that wasn't what made her happy. "I'm happy that you were there," said finally. "I'm happy that you heard me play. That's what I always wanted. Not the audience, not the applause, just you." Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears again. She seemed to do a lot of crying these days, but they were always happy tears. "I heard you every night," her grandmother said. "For 3 years, through the walls. I would finish washing the dishes or folding the laundry and I would stand outside your door and just listen. I never said anything because I didn't want to embarrass you, but I heard every note, every song, every mistake and every breakthrough." Stared at her grandmother in surprise. "You never told me." "Some things don't need to be said," her grandmother replied, taking his hand in her own. "They just need to be believed in. I always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. I knew this day would come. I was just waiting for you to be ready." Leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder. She thought about all those nights alone in her room, playing with her headphones on, thinking nobody could hear her. All that time her grandmother had been listening. All that time she had never been as alone as she thought. "Thank you," whispered, "for the keyboard, for believing in me, for everything." Her grandmother kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for sharing your gift with the world. Mister was right. Music isn't meant to be kept hidden. It's meant to be heard. And now everyone knows what I've known all along." "What's that?" Her grandmother smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when she was truly happy. "That my granddaughter is extraordinary." They sat together in the quiet apartment as the night grew late, the grandmother and the girl who had been invisible for so long. Outside, the world was waiting with all its opportunities and challenges and unknowns. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because had learned something more important than any scholarship could teach her. She had learned that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being terrified and doing it anyway. She had learned that the people who love you see your gifts even when you can't see them yourself. And she had learned that sometimes, the scariest thing you can do is also the most beautiful. She had stopped hiding. She had let herself be seen. And in doing so, she had discovered that she was never really invisible at all. She just needed to find the courage to shine.